Take a moment and imagine this. The sun has just come up. The dew is still clinging to the leaves, and you slip out the back door. You stroll under the canopy of your own small forest, reaching up for a ripe plum, brushing past bushes heavy with blueberries, a few cherries still clinging on from spring, and the scent of mint and lemon balm rising from the ground cover at your feet. When you planted this little grove years ago, you could have filled it with lawn or a single peach tree, but instead you created a living, breathing ecosystem that feeds you. Now, even in the hottest summer or during unexpected droughts, the shade and diversity of your backyard forest keep producing. The soil holds moisture like a sponge, and the wildlife does the pest control for you. It may sound like magic, but this is the promise of a food forest, and you can build one with as few as 7 trees. Modern gardens often resemble monocultures, neat rows of single crops, endless mowing, and constant inputs. Yet in nature, most landscapes, if left alone, tend toward forest. That mature state, known as ecological succession, is stable, self-perpetuating, and resilient. A food forest is a garden intentionally designed to mimic that mature system. Rather than a single species competing for resources, a food forest combines trees, shrubs, herbs, ground covers, and vines to create many layers, each supporting the others. Permaculturists sometimes talk about 7 layers of a forest garden: tall trees, smaller understory trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants, ground covers, climbers, and root crops. This layered diversity does more than look pretty. It makes the system more efficient. The big trees provide shade and moisture retention. The understory and shrub layers bear fruits at different heights. Ground covers suppress weeds. Root plants loosen the soil, and vines climb into the sunny spots. Over time, such a system can produce 3 to 5 times more food than conventional gardening while requiring far less maintenance. 50 years ago, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren formalized these ideas under the banner of permaculture. Since then, gardeners in climates from the tropics to temperate zones have rediscovered the ancient practice of cultivating food forests. They noticed that by carefully choosing species suited to their climate and giving them space to interact, they could build backyard ecosystems that feed their families for decades. So, what does it look like to start from an ordinary suburban lawn and transform it into a resilient 7-tree food forest? That journey begins with a question: what do you want from your land? There's one choice at the very beginning that will determine whether your food forest thrives or struggles. Our story starts with an empty yard, a patch of grass baking in the afternoon sun. The gardener in this story is near retirement, a person who has spent decades mowing lawns and weeding vegetable beds. He's tired of the endless upkeep and wants something that will, in his words, outlive me and feed my grandchildren. The first step he takes is not to dig or plant, but to sit quietly on the land and observe. He notes where the sun moves across the sky, which patches stay damp after a rain, and where the wind funnels through. He listens for birds and insects, pays attention to wild plants that already thrive there, and even visits nearby forests to see what species grow in the same climate. By aligning with nature rather than fighting it, he knows the system will later require less labor. After observation comes selection. He decides on 7 trees, each with a role. The first is a canopy tree, perhaps a walnut or chestnut, chosen because it will one day tower overhead and provide shade, protein-rich nuts, and a natural framework for the entire forest. Beneath it, he plants 2 understory trees, maybe an Asian pear and a mulberry. These smaller trees produce fruits in dappled light and fill the space between. Next comes the shrub layer: elderberries, currants, and gooseberries, offering berries accessible from arm's reach. To weave through the lower canopy, he chooses vines like hardy kiwi or grapes, plants that can climb the canopy and bear clusters of fruit. For ground covers, he selects strawberries and mint to suppress weeds and attract pollinators. And in the rhizosphere, he plans for sweet potatoes, Jerusalem artichokes, and lilies, root crops that break up the soil. But how do you plant these 7 trees so that they don't compete with each other? Instead of lining them up like a miniature orchard, he arranges them as a guild, a grouping of mutually supportive plants. At the center stands the canopy tree. Within its strip line, he places nitrogen-fixing shrubs like gumi or Siberian pea shrub, which feed the soil, and flowering herbs like comfrey and bee balm that attract pollinators and can be chopped and dropped for mulch. He knows that in a food forest, fertility doesn't come from bags of synthetic fertilizer, but from plants themselves: mulch plants, nutrient accumulators, and nitrogen fixers. By layering these species, he creates a self-regulating ecosystem. The leaves that fall from the canopy feed the soil, the flowers support beneficial insects, and the vines produce fruit without shading out the understory. The spacing is intentional. The canopy tree is set far enough away from the house to avoid shading it in winter, but close enough to access nuts in autumn. The understory trees occupy a ring around it, each about 10 to 15 feet apart. Shrubs fill the spaces between, and ground covers fill gaps quickly to keep out weeds and hold moisture. He also designs water catchment. Shallow swales along the contour of the slope capture rainwater and slowly release it to the trees. This approach mimics the natural forest floor, where soil holds water like a sponge, giving his 7 trees resilience during dry spells. He thinks he has thought of everything, but then something unexpected happens in the 2nd year. A surprise visitor arrives: deer. They nibble on the young chestnut sapling and strip leaves from the mulberries. Our gardener is heartbroken. He considers fencing, but instead observes again. He notices that wild blackberries along the edges deter deer and provide fruit. Taking a cue from nature, he plants a thicket of thorny shrubs around the perimeter, creating a living fence that protects his young trees and yields berries. The deer move on. This incident teaches him another lesson. Obstacles often lead to creative solutions when we work with natural processes. With time, another challenge appears: shade. As the canopy tree grows, the understory receives less light. Instead of pruning it severely, the gardener remembers that food forests rely on species adapted to shade. He underplants the pear with pawpaws and serviceberries, fruits that thrive under a canopy. The mulberries, which prefer more sun, are pruned to keep them within reach and maintain light for the shrubs below. His guild shifts, evolves, and teaches him that a food forest is not a static installation, but a dynamic, living system. There's one tree he plants that seems insignificant at first, but it will soon become the hero of the whole system. The 5th tree in his 7-tree system is a persimmon. Planted on the western side, it tolerates partial shade and produces fruit in late autumn when most other fruits are gone. It's also loved by wildlife, drawing birds and squirrels. The 6th tree, a cold hardy fig, offers sweet fruit in early summer and has thick leaves that drop to create valuable mulch. The 7th tree is perhaps the most surprising, a nitrogen-fixing locust. It doesn't provide edible fruit, but its symbiosis with soil bacteria captures atmospheric nitrogen and enriches the soil for its neighbors. In a forest, not every plant is there for direct human harvest. Some exist to support the community. As the seasons turn, he notices another phenomenon. The diversity of flowering times extends the foraging season for pollinators. The locust blossoms in spring, the pears in early summer, the figs and mulberries midsummer, the persimmon and grapes in autumn. By staggering blooms and harvests, his backyard becomes a sanctuary for bees, butterflies, and birds. The beauty of it all touches his sense of wonder. Where once there was lawn, now there is life. But how do 7 trees feed a family for 20 years? The secret is in what happens beneath the soil. After a few years, the root systems of his 7 trees intertwine with mycorrhizal fungi. These networks exchange nutrients and water between species, effectively expanding the reach of each plant. The gardener stops tilling and allows leaves to accumulate. Over time, the soil becomes rich with organic matter, and the underground web of roots and fungi holds moisture even through droughts. The rhizosphere layer of root crops the sweet potatoes and lilies, yields tubers year after year without replanting. The strawberries spread and self-seed, covering the ground with edible carpets. He realizes that his greatest labor now is the harvest, not maintenance. As the harvest increases, he begins to share with neighbors. They're surprised at how much food can come from such a small space. He explains that the secret isn't really the number of trees, but their relationships. Each tree, shrub, and herb plays a role in the system's health and productivity. In typical orchards, a single disease can wipe out the crop, but diversity buffers against failure. When late frost damages the pear blossoms one year, the mulberries still fruit. When a summer storm topples a branch from the walnut, the locust sprouts new shoots and continues feeding the soil. Resilience is built into the design. Now that the garden seems to take care of itself, the gardener faces a different kind of challenge abundance. About 7 years in, the food forest reaches a tipping point. The walnut has spread its canopy, and the understory is a tangle of productive life. The gardener wakes one morning in late summer and realizes that he no longer worries about water or fertilizer. The system has become self-sustaining, a miniature climax community. He's harvesting nuts, pears, berries, persimmons, figs, grapes, and sweet potatoes, along with herbs and greens from the ground cover. There's more food than his family can eat fresh, so he learns to dry figs, preserve grapes into raisins, freeze berries, and cure nuts for winter. The freezer and pantry fill with jars and bags. The abundance brings a new sense of security. He knows that even if market prices rise or supply chains falter, his yard will continue producing. And yet, there's another turning point at work. He notices that his relationship to time has changed. He no longer views gardening as a seasonal chore, but as a lifelong conversation with his land. He thinks back to that first year, sitting quietly and observing, and realizes how much the land has taught him. The forest, once a dream, has become both teacher and provider. The key insight is clear. By designing with nature, by planting for long-term relationships rather than short-term yields, we gain not only food, but resilience and peace of mind. The gardener's neighbors are skeptical at first, but their minds change when an unexpected event shakes the community. A decade after planting, a severe drought hits the region. Lawns turn brown, and conventional gardens wilt without daily watering. In this story, the gardener's food forest endures. The deep roots of the trees tap into moisture far below the surface, and the leaf litter and ground cover reduce evaporation. The system continues to produce berries and nuts, while neighbors struggle with withered vegetables. Intrigued, they ask how he managed to keep his plants alive. He invites them in, shares fruit and cuttings, and tells them about the 7 layers and the roles each plant plays. Where once there was skepticism, now there is curiosity. A quiet revolution begins as more neighbors plant guilds of their own. In the same year, a late frost arrives unexpectedly in spring. It kills the blossoms of some fruit trees in nearby orchards. But within the food forest, the diversity of species means there are still plenty of harvests, pawpaws being more frost-resistant, fruit normally. The persimmons buds had not yet opened. The grapes push new shoots from the previous year's cane. The gardener realizes that resilience is not just about water or soil. It's about time, staggering blooming periods and harvest windows so that no single event can wipe out the entire yield. After the drought, the food forest surprises him in a completely different way, one that changes how he thinks about aging and legacy. One autumn evening, His granddaughter asks why the garden looks different from others. He tells her about each tree, pointing out how the locust feeds the soil, how the mulberries feed birds and children alike, how the vines climb and reach for sunlight. For the first time, he sees the garden through her eyes, not just as a food source, but as a storybook of relationships. He realizes that the greatest harvest may not be the food at all, but the lessons in ecology, patience, and care. The food forest becomes a living inheritance, not just of produce, but of knowledge. He decides to keep a journal for his grandchildren, explaining which species were planted, why, and how they should be cared for. In doing so, he ensures that the system will continue long after he is gone. As his perspective shifts from yield to legacy, he starts to see bigger implications for his community and the planet. The food forest does more than feed a family. It creates habitat for songbirds, insects, and amphibians. It sequesters carbon and builds soil. It moderates the local microclimate. Over time, the gardener notices more butterflies and pollinators. The berries attract robins and blue jays, whose droppings help fertilize the ground. Chickens occasionally wander through, eating pests and spreading mulch with their scratching. The system is messy compared to a manicured lawn, but that messiness is life. He begins to see his yard as part of a larger ecological web. He imagines what could happen if many backyards in his neighborhood adopted similar systems: corridors for wildlife, a mosaic of edible landscapes, reduced runoff in storms and cooler summer temperatures. What started as a personal project now feels like a small piece of something much larger. In conversation with neighbors, he also discovers that a food forest offers social benefits. The abundance fosters sharing. He trades figs for eggs, mulberries for honey, nuts for homemade bread. These exchanges build relationships and a sense of community. Unlike a fenced-off garden where each person guards their produce, the food forest invites people in. The shade of the walnut tree becomes a gathering place for evening chats. In a world where many seniors feel isolated, his backyard becomes a space of connection. Could this simple design help address bigger challenges like food insecurity and climate resilience? As he reflects on the broader implications, he recalls the early permaculture writings that suggested a well-designed food forest could feed people for decades with minimal input. He realizes that for those on fixed incomes, a food forest offers a measure of food security: nuts and fruits that store through winter, perennial greens that reappear each spring. For communities facing climate extremes, these systems buffer heat and drought. On a larger scale, widespread adoption of perennial agriculture could reduce pressure on industrial farming, which often leads to soil erosion and chemical pollution. Food forests also create carbon sinks. Each tree sequesters carbon in its wood and in the rich soil built from decaying leaves. The gardener, once simply curious about feeding his family, now sees that his 7-tree system participates in a global effort to heal the earth. Yet there is one last question he ponders. How do you pass on a forest? 20 years have passed since he planted that first sapling. The walnut now towers and drops bushels of nuts each autumn. The persimmon's orange fruit is a seasonal celebration. The fig and grapes are pruned each winter by his adult children who have learned the rhythms of the forest. The locust has been coppiced several times to provide poles for beam trellises and firewood. Its regrowth continues to feed the soil. His granddaughter, now an adult herself, has started a food forest in her own yard, using cuttings and grafts from the original trees. In his journal, he writes about the cycles he has witnessed: drought and flood, abundance and scarcity, pests and predators, growth and decay. He understands that a food forest is not a static installation, but a relationship across generations. As he sits under the canopy one evening, he reflects on how the project changed him. In the beginning, he wanted a garden that would feed him without constant work. He achieved that the system has fed his family for 20 years, but he gained something deeper: a sense of belonging to the land, and a legacy of stewardship. He whispers to himself that the true magic of the 7-tree food forest is not in the number of trees, but in the relationships among them and between the gardener and the earth. Closing his journal, he smiles and thinks about the people he has shared this story with. Perhaps they will plant their own 7 trees. Observe, listen, and let nature do the heavy lifting. Perhaps, like him, they will discover that a food forest is a gift that keeps giving, year after year. The story may end here, but the forest will continue to grow.